The Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Great Depression, World War I and II, Korea, Vietnam, and most recently the COVID pandemic, Martin Guitars has survived and flourished throughout all these world events. The company has grown to become the most respected maker of acoustic guitars in the history of the instrument. Martin's influence is huge. After a trip to the factory in October 2022, I learned far more about the legacy of the company and was inspired to make this documentary for you. Martin Guitars, A Short History.
Hi, I'm Jason Honor, the Archives and Museum Manager at Martin Guitar, and it's great to have Mary with us. Today we're going to walk through the museum and take a look at the great collection we have here and learn a lot about the history of Martin Guitar.
Martin headstocks may be dated with 1833, but that's only the date when Martins were first made in the United States. Martin guitar making dates back to as early as 1807, with records showing Johann Georg Martin making guitars in the family's ancestral home, Marknerkirchen, in Germany.
The oldest document in our archives is Johann Georg Martin's baptismal certificate. He was C.F. Martin Sr.'s father, and it's from 1765.
Johann's son, Christian Frederick Martin, CF, who had trained as a luthier in Vienna, set sail for the New World, landing in New York City in 1833, before moving to Pennsylvania in 1839.
Now in this case, we have the oldest Martin guitar known to exist. So this is a model from the earlier part of 1834. Now one of the ways that you date these early Martin guitars is off of the design of the label. Martin went through a number of designs early on. He only used some for a very short period, and from the records we have in our archives, we know that this guitar features the earliest label that he used. It also lists his 196 Hudson Street address. That is where the family set up their home and shop when they arrived in New York City. By looking at it, you can see the heavy violin influence on these early guitars with the maple back and sides and just the figure eight shape. Now, one thing I always point out when talking about early Martin guitars is, yes, they did use paper labels, but Martin guitars always were stamped. C.F. Martin, New York, or C.F. Martin and Company, New York, or C.F. Martin and Company, Nazareth, Pennsylvania. So you can break down the periods that they were built in based off of the stamps, because all of these early guitars didn't have serial numbers.
Can I take this one home?
Yeah, how much cash you got?
His New York operation was more than just a music shop. C.F. Martin imported and exported a range of instruments and music supplies and built guitars for customers and other music shopkeepers to sell. But the Martin family didn't find New York to their tastes, and on May 29, 1839, C.F. Martin sold the shop and bought an 8-acre lot in Bushkill Township, Pennsylvania. By the 1850s, business was thriving, and sales ledgers show as many as 20 guitars a month being shipped to customers. In 1852, 215 guitars were built, increasing to 303 the next year. Available in a range of sizes, C.F. Martin experimented with a range of styles, going on to develop what would become recognizable as the American guitar we know today.
Now, one of the biggest innovations to come out of the Cherry Hoe period, not just for Martin, but for the entire acoustic guitar industry, was X-bracing. So we have, in this case, the earliest known X-brace guitar to exist. It was built in 1843 for a performer named Madame Degoni. She was the most popular concert guitarist on the East Coast during that time. So what happened was, according to the Martin family story, C.F. Martin snuck away with her guitar and took the dimensions off of it and built a guitar with the same dimensions, but what was completely different was the bracing system. He built her the first X-brace guitar. So this is the exact guitar that Martin built for Madame Degoni. Martin preferred to use pin bridges. So as you see, this guitar is a pin bridge, and if he was using a traditional Spanish fan bracing, sometimes he would hit the braces when he was drilling a pinhole, and then he would have to either pull the top off of the guitar and repair the brace or replace it, or just let it go, and it probably wouldn't affect the guitar too much. But we see guitars in the late 1830s and early 1840s where he's experimenting with different bracing patterns, combining fan braces and kind of an X-brace pattern until he builds this guitar. Obviously, he must have really liked the way it sounded and the structural stability he gave the guitar, because going forward, pretty much all of Martin's guitars use X-bracing, and fast forward to now, the vast majority of our guitars are X-braced, and most builders that build flat top steel string guitars like we do use some form of X-bracing.
Attempting to keep track of the wood, binding and decoration of each model, accountants and bookkeepers devised a numerical system to differentiate them. The first number was the size, followed by a second 2-digit number corresponding to the wholesale price, i.e. 1 to 21 was a size 1 that cost $21 wholesale. The style numbers, like 18, 21, 28, and 42, are still in use today. After 2 highly successful decades, the company was ready to expand. A change in location was needed. In 1859, the Martin family moved from Cherry Hill to a large lot on the corner of Main and North Streets in the town of Nazareth, the family's home for the next century.
Here we have what a workbench would look like at the North Street factory. Now really this could be circa 1920, you have the Edison style bulbs, but one of the most important things about this area is the tool case on the back wall, because we believe these are the tools that C.F. Martin Sr. came with when he came to the United States in 1833.
The onset of the Civil War caused a steep drop in production, but sales bounced back as word spread and demand for Martin's high-quality guitars increased. C.F. Sr. passed control of the business over to his son Frederick Jr. in the mid-1850s after a stroke made him unable to continue working full-time. In 1867, C.F. Sr. formed a co-partnership with his son and a nephew, Christian Frederick Hartmann, who had followed the family to America from Germany. The company stamp was changed to C.F. Martin & Co. instead of C.F. Martin, allowing the 19th century models to be divided into pre-1867 and post-1867. This was a period of refinement for the company, as the more ornate models and features were phased out or standardized. 1876 to 1879 were particularly hard years, as the nation suffered an economic dip. Total annual sales dropped to roughly 100 guitars a year, less than half of its output 20 years earlier. By 1883, sales had picked up to over 250 a year again, but the company faced continued challenges. In 1888, C.F. Jr. died at the age of 67 after a short illness. Frank Henry Martin, the first American-born man to head the company, took over, aged just 22. He faced an uncertain landscape as competitors lured in high-profile players with endorsement deals, a practice that Martin had been reluctant to participate in. The company hadn't innovated in years and was weak in its marketing. It desperately needed to modernize. Under Frank Henry, Martin returned to selling direct to music dealers, having previously been exclusively distributed by C.A. Zoebish and Sons of New York. He ordered the company to start producing mandolins, popular in the US at the time, and slashed prices of their existing models to encourage sales. The emerging market of western states of the USA exploded, making up half of the company's revenue in the early years of the 20th century. Frank Henry continued refining the company, eliminating older models, and in 1898 amending the brand name from C.F. Martin & Co. New York to C.F. Martin & Co. Nazareth, PA, 60 years after leaving New York City. Martin guitars were finally marked with their true origin. From 1898, in a few short years, more changes were made to Martin's line of guitars than had been made in the past 40 years. Pearl position markers were added to the fretboards, and larger sizes like the Triple O were introduced. In 1904, Style 45 was added above Style 42. Hand-rubbed French polish finish was replaced in favour of shellac and varnish. But Martin still faced fierce competition, especially from an up-and-coming guitar company called Gibson, who massively outranked them in sales. Frank Henry knew Martin had to make substantial changes to stay in business. Changing from gut to steel strings helped the bottom line, but the company was saved by an explosion in popularity of a new type of music, and it would transform their fortunes like never before. In 1915, Hawaiian music swept America. Ukuleles were suddenly in such high demand that music dealers couldn't keep up. Martin introduced its first models in January 1916, and for the next decade, they accounted for the bulk of the company's income.
The origins of the ukulele go back to the island of Madeira off Portugal. Madeira's chief crop was wine, and in the 1870s, there was a grape famine. So wine production was way down. So some of the men from Madeira left looking for work, and they ended up in Hawaii because they heard that there was work in the sugarcane fields there. And they brought with them this little instrument they called the machete. Very quickly it caught on in Hawaii. They started calling it the ukulele. One of the most historically significant instruments we have in our museum is a ukulele that was owned by Richard Conter. He was an officer in the United States Navy. He volunteered to go with Admiral Byrd on the first expedition to the North Pole. While on that trip, he became friends with Byrd's pilot, Floyd Bennett. And he said to Bennett, you know what, I want a souvenir from this trip. So Bennett agreed to smuggle the ukulele on the plane that him and Byrd were flying over the North Pole. So they make the flight. Bennett gives the ukulele back to Conter. Conter has the crew of the ship sign it. Then there's a reception for them in Washington, D.C., and he has the president of the U.S. at the time, Calvin Coolidge, sign it, Thomas Edison signed it, Amelia Earhart signed it, and he also documented his travels on the ukulele. Right now we're building a reproduction that's made from Hawaiian koa like the original, but the signatures are laser engraved in the ukulele so you can see where everybody signed. Hawaiian music also affected Martin's guitar production because in 1915 they start building their first steel string guitars for their customer Southern California music. And so Hawaiian music features steel strings on a guitar where the guitar is played flat on your lap with a steel bar. There's two gentlemen that created this style of playing. They were childhood friends in Honolulu, Joseph Kikuku and Makia Kealakai. And so when you look at how Hawaiian music changed popular music, it's really important to state that fact that those two gentlemen and Hawaiian music really changed the way the guitar would be played in the future, because all of these Hawaiian musicians were touring the United States in the 19-teens and 1920s. And you can hear their influence on country music, on blues, all of these different genres of music that are popular now.
Martin grew from selling 162 guitars and 300 mandolins in 1915 to 1,524 mandolins, 1,336 guitars, and 3,150 ukuleles in 1920. Extraordinary growth for a 5-year period. For the first time, Frank Henry's biggest problem was that demand outstripped supply. In 1921, Frank Henry officially turned Martin Guitars into a corporation, with his wife and 2 sons as the other shareholders. New buildings were added to the factory to increase production capacity. Martin's regular 6-string model had remained pretty much unchanged for decades, but as the Hawaiian craze faded, it refocused its efforts on the instrument that had first put the company on the map. From 1921 to 1935, Martin created more new guitar models and made more changes than at any time in the company's history. Enter the OM-28.
The late 1920s through World War II is considered the golden era of Martin. And one of the key innovations from that time are the orchestra models. The first orchestra model, which was an OM-28, was built for a banjo player named Perry Bechtel. So this was 1929. He was a plectrum banjo player, which I guess that style of banjo was losing popularity, so he was looking to switch over to being more of a guitar player. He found archtop guitars that he liked, but he couldn't find any flat top guitars. So he contacted Martin and asked if they could build him a guitar with a 15-fret neck. And they thought about it and they were like, you know what, we don't think it would be stable. Maybe we can build one with a 14-fret neck. So what they did was they took their triple O guitar and squared off the shoulders and then took a longer, slimmer neck and created this brand new style of guitar. The OM-28 became a hit with a lot of early jazz guitarists that were looking to switch over from, if they weren't playing an archtop guitar to a flat top guitar. And very quickly, Martin started to change over their entire lineup to the new 14 fret design. And really, when you look at the OM28 that was built in 1929, that's considered the first modern acoustic guitar. Because if you look at that guitar and look at what we build now, there's so many similarities. And that's one of the reasons why the guitars from that period through World War II go for so much money. I mean, the values of them. In this case, we have a 1930 OM45 Deluxe, where there was only 11 of them built in 1930. So it's probably the rarest guitar we have in our collection. And because of that, it's worth around $300,000. So when you look at this guitar, I mean, it looks like something that the company would build today. Not only was Martin building 14 fret guitars at that time, other builders took notice and started changing over their lineups to similar designs. So the reason why this is a deluxe model and not just an OM45 is it had an inlaid pickguard and an inlaid bridge. And the reason why Martin only built 11 of them was because they had trouble sourcing these materials because they weren't done in-house. Martin would do the inlay on the top of the guitar and the fingerboard, but not on the pickguard. One of the unique features about this guitar, I should point out, is the neck profile. So it's slightly asymmetrical. And the neck on this guitar was the basis for the necks on our modern deluxe models. So that vintage deluxe neck profile is taken from this OM45 Deluxe.
Introduced in 1929, the guitar was an instant success. With its long, slim neck, solid headstock and pickguard, the OM has been heralded as the first truly modern flat-top guitar. Initially designed for plectrum playing in orchestras, the OM was adopted by cowboy bands, America's newfound musical obsession. And in 1932, the iconic gold decal was added to the headstock. The stock market crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression, devastating not just Martin, but the music industry as a whole. Compared to the ukulele boom years, where the company sold about 10,000 a year, sales collapsed to just over 700 annually by 1933. The work week was reduced to 3 days, and the factory produced only what it was sure it could sell. But during this time, Martin introduced what would become its most popular model, the Dreadnought.
The guitars that Martin is probably best known for are our Dreadnought models, the D18, the D28. So the origins of the Dreadnought actually go back to 1916. I mentioned Makia Kealakai earlier, the Hawaiian guitarist. Well, Martin had built a special instrument for him that was larger than a triple O. And Martin was building special instruments for their dealer, the Ditson Company, where they had this wide-waisted shape. It was a different design. They saw the drawings for the Kealakai guitar and asked Martin if Martin could build them something the size of the Kealakai guitar, but in their special shape. So Martin did. They built this really large guitar, and they weren't quite sure what to call it. So it was World War I era, and they decided to borrow the name of the British warship, the HMS Dreadnought, for their guitar. So when you look at a Dreadnought, a D28, D18, that's what that D stands for. It stands for Dreadnought. Here we have one of the original Dreadnoughts, a Ditson 111. The Ditson 111 is pretty similar to a D18, spruce top, mahogany back and sides, a little bit different inlay, but you can see from this guitar it is the 12th fret design, so it's a very large body, a wider neck, and the neck is shorter. Now, Martin built less than 30 of these for Ditson before they went out of business in 1930. And Martin had to decide what they wanted to do with the Dreadnought at that point. What they did was they decided to build it under their own name and sell it to all of their dealers. And here we have the first D28. So like the Ditson 111, it's that larger design. So early on, Martin really didn't sell too many Dreadnoughts. It's when the company switched the Dreadnought to the OM design, the 14 fret design, that's when Dreadnought models really took off with the early country and bluegrass musicians at that time. Now, you can't really talk about pre-war Dreadnoughts without mentioning the D45. So to a lot of guitar collectors, a pre-war D45 is the holy grail, the most collectible acoustic guitar ever built. Martin only built 91 before they stopped production because of World War II. We actually have number 80 out of 91 in our museum. In 1933, Martin built the first D45 for Gene Autry, which was the larger 12 fret design. But then they, in 1934, started building 14 fret models like this. Now, the D45 went through a few changes. The company would change the fingerboard inlay to this Art Deco hexagon design in 1938. Now, originally, Style 45 instruments all had snowflakes inlaid on the fingerboard, but Martin wanted to set the D45 aside. They saw how popular their Dreadnoughts were becoming, so they gave the D45 this new design to go along with the archtop guitars they were building at the time. Now, this guitar is pretty much all original, except at some point somebody put a strap button on the heel. I guess they were playing some shows or something and wanted to use a strap instead of the old strap, the tie that would go through the headstock. I mean, I can see why they wouldn't want to use that on a guitar like this anyway, because you wouldn't want to block the beautiful pearl inlay on this head plate. These are the most collectible flat tops. This guitar is worth around $500,000.
Large and loud, the Dreadnought was just what singers had been looking for, an instrument with enough power to compete with horns, fiddles, and other loud instruments. The Dreadnought D18 became one of the company's best sellers, and Martin rode out the Depression thanks to its innovations, flexibility, and low existing debts. World War II led to shortages of materials like brass and steel. Less successful instruments were shelved, and by 1944, the Martin catalogue was much leaner, half the size of a few years previously.
Now, that period, the 1940s, the late 1940s through 1963, this is really when you see bluegrass music, country music, then rock and roll, and folk music becoming very, very popular. They start to bypass big band music, become the most popular genre of music for their time. In here we have a pretty unique guitar when it comes to the history of guitars in general. It was owned by a gentleman named Fred Clay, who was in a country band in Southern California. He happened to be friends with Leo Fender. At this time, Leo Fender was building amps and PAs. He hadn't gotten into guitar building yet. He was also building lap steel guitars. So Fred Clay goes into his shop and says, you know what, I'm having trouble being heard in my band. Can you help me out? So what Leo did was he hooked up one of his lap steel pickups to Fred's 00018. And that happened to be Leo Fender's first experiment at electrifying a fretted instrument. So here you can see the work that Leo Fender did on this 00018. His lap steel pickup right here. I mean, it doesn't look that pretty, but hopefully for Fred Clay it served the purpose and people were able to hear him on stage. But it's just another groundbreaking instrument that we have in our collection.
Frank Henry retired in 1945, leaving behind a legacy to be proud of. He had successfully steered the company through tremendous adversity. He was succeeded by C.F. Martin III, Frederick, whose own son Frank quickly became Martin's head of sales, hitting the road and discovering that demand for Martin guitars was far greater than had been thought. He became vice president in 1963 and spearheaded the move to a new 62,000 square foot factory on the southeast corner of Bale and Sycamore Streets, ramping up production to help capitalize on the booming new folk movement. Pictured everywhere at Woodstock, the Martin D28 was fast becoming an iconic instrument, in the same field as the Fender Stratocaster and Gibson Les Paul. Martin sold over 14,000 guitars in 1969.
If you would have went into a Martin dealer in the late 1950s and ordered a D28, they would have told you to come back in 3 years, because that's how bad the backlog was for Martin at that time. So they knew they needed to change. At that point, they were still in the North Street factory, which was expanded on multiple times. It was 4 stories high, and it just wasn't large enough for them to keep up with the demand at the time. During that time, Frank Herbert Martin, who was C.F. Martin III's son, started working for the company. And he was really in tune with the music scene at the time. He was in his 20s, and he saw the way music was trending, and he started urging his father to build a bigger, more modern factory. So in late 1963, the company broke ground and then opened the Sycamore Street factory in July of 1964. That's the factory we're in now. That's where our museum's at, where you can take a tour. And from that, after the Sycamore Street factory opens, you can see production totals really start going up. So by the early 1970s, Martin is building over 20,000 guitars a year, which for them, that was a huge amount. In this case, we have a special guitar that was owned by Joan Baez. So in the 1960s, she was one of the best known folk performers at the time. She used primarily a single 045 from 1929, but she met a woman at the University of California and fell in love with this woman's single 040. It was a model from around 1880 that was owned by the woman's grandmother. But Joan convinced the woman to trade 2 guitars for her single 045. And so Joan used this guitar in the mid-1960s on tours and on albums. But eventually, the woman she traded the guitar with felt bad because it was her grandmother. So Joan was nice enough to give it back to her. But eventually, it made its way to our museum. The coolest feature about this guitar is that it has Joan Baez's set list still taped to the side, so you can see what she was playing when she was doing live shows. Little less appointments than style 45s, so this doesn't have the pearl inlay around the extension of the fingerboard on the top, and also, like a style 42, doesn't have pearl around the back and the sides. This is a 1929 018K that was owned by Les Paul. It was his first good guitar. I guess he had a cheaper Sears catalog guitar before this, and he was getting better on the guitar, so he told his mom, I need something better to learn on, so she bought this for him. Now, if you look, it has numbers written on the fingerboard that Les put there. So I guess he would sneak out of his home at night to go to a jazz club in Waukesha, Wisconsin, where he was from, to see a local jazz guitarist. And he would write down on a napkin where he was playing, and then he would go home and try to play in the same spots on this guitar. So, very important part of guitar history right here.
In late 1969, Martin had to cease using Brazilian rosewood as the country introduced an embargo on the export of these rare and valuable raw logs. The company switched to Indian rosewood. As sales boomed a peak in 1971 with over 22,000 guitars built that year, Frank Martin used the profits to acquire Darco Strings and a second string factory, Bridgeport Musical Strings. Consolidating the two created the highly lucrative Martin String division, but not all was well at Nazareth. By the mid-1970s, there was a period of strife between the company's employees and its leadership, culminating in a strike that lasted 8 months before a group of employees resigned from the union and returned to work. Guitar sales in the 1980s plummeted as the popularity of synthesizers reshaped modern music. Martin made an ill-fated attempt to enter the electric guitar market with its 28 series, which was abandoned in 1983. In 1982, the company sold just 3,000 guitars, its worst sales in over 4 decades. Enter Chris Martin, Frank Martin's first child and only son, who took his place at the company in 1978. Having studied business administration at Boston University. In 1979, Martin announced the custom shop, allowing customers greater freedom in their chosen design and also giving Martin valuable information on what customers actually wanted. Some of the most popular custom shop creations would eventually make it to stock status, like the HD28 variation called the Custom 15. During this period, Frank Martin's increasingly erratic behaviour, combined with a series of poor business decisions and failed investments, resulted in him being asked to resign by the board of directors in May 1982. The vice president C. Hugh Bloom, also known as Tigger, was appointed president. Frank died in 1993, and while he is often linked to the company's troubles in the 1970s, he's also responsible for much of Martin's success in the folk music era. In 1983, Martin Guitars celebrated 150 years of business. In 1985, C.F. Martin III nominated his grandson Chris, now aged 30, to the position of Vice President of Marketing. One of his early successes was the J40, a hybrid guitar with the body shape of an M38, but the added depth of the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought shape had become closely associated with country, bluegrass, and folk rock, so the J40 gave players that desirable Martin tone without the associations of any particular genre. And the timing couldn't have been better, as in 1985 the acoustic guitar began to return in popularity as a new generation of singer-songwriters, many of them women, stepped into the limelight. A new lower-priced Dreadnought, the D16, was introduced to the market in 1986 and was an immediate success. Made in Nazareth, it sounded every bit as good as the other models. Martin had dominated the higher-end market for a while now, but it had found a winning formula: lower-priced models that didn't compromise on quality. C.F. Martin III died in 1986 at the age of 91, having steered the company through its fair share of trouble. At age 31, Chris Martin was voted in as CEO by the board, hoping that once again a family member would steer the company out of trouble. A stock valuation that same year recommended the company be liquidated. Chris Martin had his work cut out. A low-priced 00016M was introduced, as were the B40 and B65 acoustic basses, and in November 1989 MTV premiered its new show format MTV Unplugged, which showed acoustic guitars were firmly back in the public consciousness. The OM21 made it to stock in 1992 and was an immediate hit with fingerstyle guitar players. 2 years after its introduction, it became the top-selling non-Dreadnought in the Martin lineup. Portable backpacker guitars were another surprise hit, with over 5,000 orders placed at the 1993 NAMM show. NASA astronaut Pierre Thought even took one into space with him on a 13-day excursion on the Columbia Space Shuttle in 1994. Technological advances in CNC technology made it possible to bring the company's artisan practices into the modern age. The D1, introduced in 1993, was the first model constructed with a new mortise and tenon neck joint and patented A-frame top bracing at a list price of just $995, including a hardshell case. The company struck a balance with an expanded line of low-price models and prestigious reissues of vintage models, along with the occasional luxury limited edition models like the D45 Deluxe, limited to just 60 and with a price tag of $18,000. 1994 was a landmark moment that saw the introduction of the Gene Autry Signature Edition D45, Martin's first signature edition for a living performer. No expense was spared on the 66 guitars, and they sold for $22,000 each, with a portion of the sale price going to the Autry Western Heritage Museum in Los Angeles. Martin had been reluctant to get involved in celebrity endorsements until now, with the policy that if you saw a famous performer playing a Martin, they had used their own money to buy it. That would change, thanks in part to one man, Eric Clapton. Clapton's 1992 MTV Unplugged and the CD that followed firmly reintroduced the acoustic guitar back into public consciousness after the wilderness years of the 1980s. Martin were inundated with calls about which guitar Clapton had been playing. 2 000 models, a stock 1939 00042 and a 1960s 00028 that had been modified with style 45 inlays and binding on the neck. Martin responded by bringing out its signature Clapton, a 00042 with a style 45 neck. The limited run of 461, tied in with Clapton's latest album 461 Ocean Boulevard, sold out immediately, much to the company's surprise. They had previously never exceeded 200 sales of any limited edition.
In 1986, C.F. Martin III passes away, and the board of directors vote Chris Martin to be CEO and chairman of the board. So he's only 31 at the time. Martin is the oldest guitar builder in the world. A very big responsibility for him. What he did was he started taking suggestions from the employees that actually built the instruments here at Martin. Then we see MTV Unplugged come out, and the interest in acoustic music from that point really starts going up. So some of the pivotal performances on MTV Unplugged were Eric Clapton. On that show, he's playing his 1939 00042. Another monumental performance was Nirvana. And on that show, Kurt Cobain was playing a 1959 D18E. We have the D18 that Kurt Cobain owned prior to the guitar he played on Unplugged. This is Grandpa, Kurt Cobain's 1953 D18. So he acquired this guitar from Mary Lou Lord, who he met when Nirvana had just released their Nevermind album. They were starting to tour to support that album, and Kurt and Mary Lou Lord became friends, and she knew that he needed a guitar for his tour. So they both loved this guitar. They nicknamed it Grandpa because it was old and beat up. And so she gave it to him. So Nirvana blows up and pretty much changes popular music in the 1990s. So Kurt played this guitar for a few years, but then he eventually gave it back to Mary Lou, who then became friends with Elliott Smith. And then he played it for a few years. And then she got it back, and she ended up selling the guitar, and then we purchased it for our collection. It's pretty crazy to think that the D18E that Kurt Cobain played on Unplugged sold for $6 million at an auction a couple of years ago, and to think what this guitar would be worth if we would do the same, but I don't think we're ever going to let it leave our museum. A lot of people, when they think of acoustic guitars or Martin guitar, they don't think of bands like Motorhead. But I mean, indeed, when Motorhead played acoustic guitars, they played Martins. And we have a guitar in our collection that we let them borrow. It got dropped and damaged, but they felt bad about it and were good enough to pay for the guitar.
At the same time, the demand for replicas of vintage guitars exploded as the baby boomer generation finally had enough money to purchase the guitars they'd always wanted. Martin, as well as Gibson and Fender, saw the incredible demand for vintage Stratocasters, Les Pauls, and Martin D28s. With vintage guitars strictly limited in number, the companies responded with lovingly made reissues, recreated right down to the tiniest detail.
The original model that was used for our first authentic was a D18. We also have done D28 authentics from 1941 and 1937. The OM45 Deluxe authentic, the 1930 model. We did a size 1 Madame Negoni authentic. The key to making a new guitar sound like a vintage guitar is in how it's built, really. And one of the things that we changed on our authentic guitars in 2014 is we started using our vintage tone system tops on them, VTS tops, where we use the process of torrefication to age them, because you can build a new guitar the same way that a vintage guitar was built, but there's really nothing you can do to advance the aging process of the wood until we found out about torrefication. So that's why we use it on those tops, because they're the most accurate new guitars when compared to a vintage instrument. And that's the key. That's why people pay so much money for Martin guitars from that pre-war period. Not just because, they're old and cool, but it's because they sound so good.
Business boomed as a range of new models found their audience. Over 22,000 guitars were shipped out from Nazareth in 1996, the highest number since 1971's record. The following years, they'd beat it by another 10,000. 1997 also saw signature models for Paul Simon, Johnny Cash and Arlo Guthrie, with Willie Nelson's N20 following in 1999. The world had an appetite for Martin guitars, and Chris Martin had seemingly steered the company through one of its roughest patches to a period of great success. Production exploded. At one Winter NAMM in the late 1990s, over 30 new models were brought to market. The company also began exploring using alternative, sustainable woods known as smartwood. The company now asks each dealer to support the program by buying at least one smartwood model a year.
One of the artists that we worked with was Sting. So the conservation of natural resources is very important to Sting. And so when we went about building his signature models, the woods that we sourced had to come from sustainable forests. We had to prove that to him in order to build them. So that's when we started building with back and side woods like cherry, reclaimed spruce from bridge timbers in Canada and Alaska, a wood for the fingerboard and bridge from Mexico called Cataloche. And that really put us on the path to where we're at now, because the vast majority of the woods we use are FSC certified that come from sustainable forest. And I mean, that's one of the tricky things about being in the guitar business is that, especially for Martin, because we've been around so long and use these core woods like rosewood and spruce and ebony and mahogany for almost 2 centuries now, that's what a lot of people expect. But we need to show people that there are other viable tone woods that we can use to make guitars that sound just as good as a guitar built from those other woods, because who knows, 50 years down the road, those guitars might not, or those woods might not be available. In the late 1990s, Martin also introduces guitars made with HPL or X series, which is another alternative to solid tone woods. Originally, they were built in our factory here in Nazareth, but now all of the X series models are built in our factory in Navajo, Mexico.
1998 saw the largest expansion in Martin's history, adding 90,000 square feet to the Sycamore Street factory, doubling its previous size. A night shift too was added, to avoid overcrowding as the company tried to keep up with the incredible demand. In 1998, guitar production had jumped up to 44,000. In 1999, it was 55,000. In 2001, 65,000. And in 2006, 82,000.
In 2006, the museum that we're in now was opened at the Martin factory. I know it was important for Chris Martin to showcase the history of his family and the history of his family's company. This is the special hand-painted Robert Getzel 175th commemorative model. As you can see on the top of the guitar, has a lot of the history of the company. You have a photo of C.F. Martin Sr., the North Street factory, an early Stauffer guitar along with the label. The Martin family motto, non salta sed multum, quality over quantity. If you want something like a 1937 D28, but you don't have $100,000 to buy one, you can get a D28 authentic for around $8,000. So, I mean, when you look at that, they're a bargain.
At the 2004 NAMM show, the company celebrated its 1 millionth guitar, a luxury Dreadnought stunningly decorated with 40 inlaid rubies and diamonds, and scenes from the company's history by inlay artist Larry Robinson. And at NAMM 2022, the company celebrated its 2.5 millionth guitar, designing the beautiful jewel-encrusted custom D 2.5 millionth, attended by yours truly. Platinum-mounted diamonds in 5 different sizes adorn the guitar in the pattern of the stars visible in the sky on the night of November 6, 1833, the day Christian Frederick Martin first stepped off the boat in New York City. Serial 2.5 million is decorated with 436 lab-created diamonds, 6 natural sapphires, and 1 ruby, which marks the location of the original Martin shop in New York City. The guitar will reside in the Martin Guitar Museum in Nazareth as a fitting tribute to the man who started it all.
Martin guitar has a great history of innovation. You look at X bracing, the OM model, the Dreadnought, and then to add to that, the SE13E, which was the best-selling acoustic electric guitar of 2021. It just goes to show that the company just doesn't settle for what we've done in the past. We're always looking to break the mold, to give the guitarist the ultimate guitar.
Thank you for watching this documentary. I'd like to thank the authors Richard Johnston and Dick Boak, whose book Martin Guitars, A History is essential reading for any Martin fan and provided much of the research for this film.